everything we could to help find her. Obviously that hasn't worked yet, but we are still looking forward. I think that's the most important thing, and there's still hope.
While the McCanns and their legal team often allowed Portuguese media outlets and journalists to operate without interference, there was one individual they seemingly refused to ignore: Gonçalo Amaral. In October 2007, following his abrupt removal from the investigation, the former lead detective began composing a book about the case. Drawing from his 6 months at the helm, Amaral laid out his professional perspective on the investigation and a theory regarding what might have happened to Madeleine McCann. Just 2 days after Portuguese police formally shelved their inquiry in July 2008, Amaral released The Truth of the Lie. The 22-chapter book immediately ignited one of the most bitter and high-profile legal battles associated with the case. The McCanns insisted that the book would cause severe damage to the ongoing search for their daughter. Their argument was straightforward. If the public were led to believe Madeleine was no longer alive, who would continue the search for her? They launched a determined legal campaign to silence Amaral's account, and initially they succeeded. An injunction banned the book, and Amaral was ordered to pay the McCanns €500,000 in damages. Kate McCann praised the court's decision, describing the publication as an injustice against her daughter. She informed reporters that the ruling demonstrated there was no evidence Madeleine had come to any harm, questioning the motives of Amaral and others who promoted the idea that she had passed away. But the tide would eventually turn. In 2016, the injunction was overturned, with Portugal's courts ruling that Amaral's right to freedom of expression had been violated. The McCanns challenged this decision, but in early 2017, the country's Supreme Court rejected their appeal. The judges concluded that the book was neither libelous nor abusive, and that Amaral had acted within his rights as a citizen and as a writer. The book had swiftly become a bestseller, selling approximately 180,000 copies in Portugal alone before being distributed to other European countries. From the outset, the legal principle was clear. Banning a book was not considered a viable option. The reasoning was simple. The possibility of an accidental death within the apartment was one of the scenarios officially considered during the investigation, and no one could forbid individuals from making logical assumptions based on public information. Portugal's Supreme Court echoed this, ruling that Amaral's book did not harm the McCanns' privacy or reputation, as everything it contained was already part of public police reports long before its publication. It felt to some as though there was a machine working against him, a machine that would do anything to cause him harm. Here, we will look into Amaral's theory, but first, it's crucial to underline the potential importance of the DNA and forensic evidence recovered from the McCanns' rental car, the silver Renault Scenic. The potential significance of this evidence cannot be overstated. In November 2007, the BBC's Panorama program focused on that very car. Reporter Richard Bilton spoke with John Corner, a close friend of the McCanns, who had been filming material for a family-approved documentary. In the segment, Bilton discussed the suggestion that Madeleine's remains may have been transported in the back of this vehicle, which the McCanns had hired 25 days after her disappearance. Some reports claimed the couple drove the Scenic to Huelva, Spain, on August the 3rd, where the remains were allegedly disposed of. The McCanns, however, pointed to Corner's footage, which they insisted documented their only trip to Huelva, arguing the video itself was proof that the journey was part of an awareness campaign. Corner himself described the speculation as deeply offensive, stressing that this was simply a family fighting desperately to keep their missing daughter in the public eye. It was later noted that police sources had expressed interest in the Scenic, particularly regarding its unusually high mileage. The car was rented on May 27, 2007, with 3,100 kilometers already on the odometer. By the time it was returned on September 23rd, the reading had climbed to 14,400 kilometers. Over 4 months, the Scenic had covered more than 11,000 kilometers, despite long periods when Kate and Gerry McCann were away on campaign trips across Europe. The investigation into the vehicle intensified when a victim recovery dog, Eddie, and a blood detection dog, Keela, alerted to scents inside and around the car, including the boot. Their handler, Martin Grime, explained that the dogs were trained to detect odor, not to determine guilt or cause of an individual's passing. Their alerts simply marked areas that warranted closer forensic examination. Samples were collected, but the testing proved inconclusive. Grime later argued that dismissing the dog's work because DNA results weren't definitive was a misunderstanding of their function. The dogs had indicated locations worth investigating, and in both apartment 5A and the Scenic, DNA was indeed recovered. The failure, he suggested, lay not with the dogs, but in the limitations of the forensic techniques being used by the laboratory at the time. This leads to one of the most pressing questions. If Madeleine's remains had truly been inside the Scenic, how could such a transfer have occurred under the constant glare of the press and police? It was later noted that it wasn't only Kate and Gerry McCann using the vehicle. Others also had access to it during that period. A similar point was raised regarding the McCanns' extensive travels to Morocco, Rome, Berlin, Amsterdam, and even the Vatican. While the couple moved across Europe, the press pack frequently followed them, leaving the Renault Scenic unobserved back in Portugal. Amaral also dismissed the idea that the couple were under non-stop surveillance, pointing out that there were stretches of time, especially overnight in Praia da Luz, when no journalists were present. When the McCanns left town, reporters often went with them, meaning the villa and the car were not under constant watch. Later, in a controversial documentary based on the truth of the lie, a woman would claim to have witnessed something unusual involving the McCanns' rental car. A woman who lived close to the Praia da Luz villa that the couple moved into in early July 2007 after leaving apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort would later come forward. In a program detailing the case, her face was obscured, but she alleged that, over a number of days, she repeatedly noticed the boot of the Renault Scenic left open, both day and night. From what is known, this woman was a lawyer who had contacted the Policia Judiciaria. Because of her profession, she was considered a credible witness. What makes this account more striking is that her testimony does not appear to have been formally recorded in the official police files, raising the question of why such a specific and seemingly credible observation might not be documented. Still, it seems clear that she had indeed spoken with investigators, whether formally or informally. The matter of the Renault Scenic wasn't merely hearsay. It was reinforced by the fact that nobody seems to have denied there was an issue with a strong smell in the car. The explanation offered at the time was that it resulted from transporting rubbish bags. But this poses a logical question. Why would rubbish need to be carried in the car unless the bins were unusually far away? And if the bags really had holes, as was suggested, the smell would surely have been all the stronger. To police investigators, the situation hinted at something more sinister, a potential attempt to mask the scent associated with human remains. This detail was later reinforced when McCann family members themselves mentioned the issue. In fact, 2 relatives gave police statements about a strange smell in the hire car. One was Alexander Cameron, who was then married to Gerry McCann's sister, Patricia. The other was Michael Wright, married to Kate McCann's cousin. Both had traveled to Praia da Luz to support the McCanns and were even added as drivers on the Renault Scenic rental agreement. Almost a year later, in April 2008, Portuguese police asked their British counterparts to take formal statements from both men. They were firm in their conviction that Kate and Gerry McCann could never have been involved in Madeleine's disappearance, stating it was impossible. Even so, both admitted there had been an unusual odor lingering in the car. Their descriptions were consistent, strange and unpleasant. Michael Wright suggested the smell may have come from rubbish bags containing Sean and Amelie's nappies, which had been left in the boot. Alexander Cameron believed it might have been the result of blood leaking from beef, fish, and shrimp he had bought from a store and placed in the car. He even recalled the stench being so strong that he removed the boot carpet, washed it, and then put it back. On May 3, 2007, Madeleine McCann was there. Sometime after nightfall, but before midnight, she was suddenly gone. 14 months later, the case was shelved by Portuguese police. Despite an exhaustive investigation, there was evidence, but nothing conclusive enough to prove how or what had happened to Madeleine. Having laid out these forensic leads, we now turn to Gonçalo Amaral's theory, presented here as a working hypothesis. The theory begins with a simple but unsettling claim, that the version of events most of us grew accustomed to, the story of an abduction, may not be the true one. Instead, it argues that Madeleine passed away inside apartment 5A, and that what followed was an attempt to disguise that fact. From the outset, investigators faced enormous pressure. Media exposure, political involvement, and diplomatic sensitivities all weighed heavily on the case. Unlike most investigations, this one could not be handled like any ordinary disappearance. Every move was scrutinized, and at times it seemed there was a deliberate effort to stifle or silence parts of the inquiry. Witnesses were reportedly hesitant, some even afraid, and key procedures like a full reconstitution of the night were never carried out. Amaral, the former PJ inspector who coordinated the investigation, presents an alternative version of events, one that is strongly rejected by the McCanns, who maintain this was an abduction. More than assigning blame, he argues the purpose of his book and documentary was to shed light on the inconsistencies of the investigation and help the public understand why the case remains unresolved. He states that Madeleine was not abducted, but instead passed away in the holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, a death that, in his view, many people wanted to cover up. On May 3, 2007, Kate and Gerry McCann made a desperate televised appeal asking for their daughter's safe return. That night, the version accepted by most was that a child asleep with her siblings had been abducted. But Amaral asks, is that truly what happened? Or was another crime concealed behind this narrative? He stresses that from the outset, there was pressure to silence aspects of the case. English police officers were reportedly forbidden from speaking publicly. Some witnesses felt afraid to testify, and others were actively prevented from speaking out. Amaral points to the importance of a reconstitution, a reenactment of events that could have clarified contradictions in testimonies. But that reconstitution never happened. According to him, certain parties resisted it, arguing it would imply suspicion of the McCanns and their friends, while also raising the risk of them leaving the country. From the very beginning, Amaral says, the investigation was made unusually difficult. The last confirmed sighting of her in public was at 5:30 p.m. on May 3rd, when Kate McCann picked her up from the resort's creche. At that same time, Gerry McCann was playing tennis a few hundred meters away, a detail confirmed by court records and his police statement. Meanwhile, the McCann's friends had tea at the Paraíso restaurant. CCTV footage shows the men leaving at 6:13 p.m., followed 15 minutes later by the women. One of them, David Payne, went to meet Gerry at the tennis court. According to Payne's police statement, he then headed to the McCann's apartment around 6:30 p.m. to check on Kate. In later questioning, however, the accounts diverged. Gerry McCann claimed Payne stayed in the apartment for 30 minutes, while Kate McCann insisted it was only 30 seconds. At that time, she said she was bathing the twins and Madeleine. Shortly after 8:40 p.m., the group, sometimes called the Tapas 9, gathered for dinner at the Tapas bar, about 50 meters from their apartments. Inside apartment 5A, Madeleine and the twins, Sean and Amaral, were left asleep. At around 10 o'clock p.m., Kate McCann raised the alarm. Madeleine was not in her bed. By 10:40 p.m., the GNR police in Lagos received a call reporting the disappearance of a little girl from the Ocean Club. According to the resort manager, Gerry McCann threw himself at an officer's feet in desperation. Officers later reported that a similar scene of distress was repeated inside the couple's bedroom. Boarders were alerted, vehicles were checked, and what would become the largest search operation ever carried out in Portugal was launched. Hundreds of GNR officers, firefighters, volunteers and police searched an area of more than 200 square kilometers, yet no trace of Madeleine McCann was found. Despite this, Gonçalo Amaral recalls, hope remained alive. Under Portuguese law, abduction does not only imply a demand for ransom, it can also include sexual motives. For that reason, the authorities continued to assume Madeleine might still be alive. The McCanns and their friends were soon questioned. Gerry McCann, 39, Kate McCann, 39, David Payne, 41, Fiona Payne, 35, and her mother, Diane Webster, 63, Matthew Oldfield, 38, Rachel Oldfield, 37, Russell O'Brien, 37, and Jane Tanner, 36. All gave initial statements. Over that first week, hundreds of witnesses were interviewed, from family members and resort employees to anyone who had contact with the child. From these statements, Amaral says, investigators began to piece together the events of the night. In fact, he alleges that family and friends had already drafted their own collective version, written on the back of one of Madeleine's coloring books, and that this draft was used to align their depositions. According to that version, at 8:45 p.m., the McCanns arrived at the Tapas bar, followed shortly by their friends. Because the children were left alone, the group took turns checking the apartments. Around 9:05 p.m., Gerry McCann went to his apartment, entered through the front door, and checked on the children. Matthew Oldfield also reported that everything seemed quiet around this time. Gerry McCann later claimed he had a strange sense that someone else had been in the room, but at the time everything appeared normal. When leaving, he encountered an English TV producer outside, who was walking his child to sleep. They spoke beneath the apartment's living room window around 9:10 p.m. The timeline continues that evening with Jane Tanner leaving the Tapas bar to check on her own children. On her way past the McCann's apartment, she crosses Gerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins, who were talking outside. Jane would later tell authorities that she saw a stranger carrying a child in his arms along Rua Dr. Agostinho da Silva. Meanwhile, Russell O'Brien and Matthew Oldfield also checked the apartments. Matthew said he looked through the door of the McCann children's bedroom, but could only see the twins. Russell stayed behind for a while to care for his sick daughter, then returned to the Tapas bar at around 9:50 p.m. At roughly the same time, on the other side of town, another potential sighting took place. The Smith family, 4 adults and 5 children, had just finished dinner. After briefly stopping for a drink, they began walking back toward their holiday apartment at about 9:50 p.m. As they crossed Rua 25 de Abril, near Rua da Escola Primaria, they saw a man carrying a child in his arms. Back at the Ocean Club, just after 10 o'clock p.m., Kate McCann went to check on her children. Taking the shorter route, she entered through the sliding patio door and discovered Madeleine was gone. She claimed the bedroom window and shutters were open. At that moment, she left the twins sleeping in a room with an open window and ran to raise the alarm. But here, from Amaral's perspective, her behavior becomes difficult to understand. Instead of calling out immediately toward the tapas bar, which was only about 50 meters away, Kate McCann reportedly took a longer path, descending the stairs and doubling the distance before reaching the restaurant. When she arrived, she shouted a phrase that some have interpreted in different ways. Everyone rushed back to apartment 5A, again entering through the main front door rather than the sliding patio door. According to Amaral, this is where contradictions begin to surface. The first concerns the distance of the route used for the checks. Every member of the group, except for Kate McCann on her final check, stated they always used the front doors, a route that was over 100 meters longer. Only the McCanns admitted they had left the sliding patio door unlocked, claiming they could see it from the restaurant. This raises a question of human behavior. Would parents in a hurry take a significantly longer route when a shorter one was available? Amaral suggests the group may have been attempting to protect themselves against accusations of neglect, as leaving young children alone in an unlocked apartment could be considered child endangerment under UK law. The second contradiction centers on Jane Tanner's account. She claimed to have seen an abductor, yet Gerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins, standing nearby, said they noticed nothing. How could Jane have seen the man while neither of them saw her or the person she described? The only possible explanation, Amaral suggests, comes from Russell O'Brien's testimony, where he claimed Jane had actually seen the man when returning from her apartment, not while heading toward it. This would mean she could have crossed paths with them unseen, but only if she had used the back route via the sliding door. Even so, Amaral concludes the detailed description Jane later gave was implausible given the distance and poor lighting. She asserted she clearly saw a dark-haired man, aged 35-40, wearing beige linen trousers, a duffel-style jacket, and black classical shoes, walking quickly while carrying a child stiffly in his arms. Her statements became the basis for the abduction theory, but for Amaral, and later even for British police, they held doubtful value. This sighting also raises another problem. Jane said she saw the man at around 9:20 p.m. Less than 30 minutes later, the Smith family also saw a man carrying a child, this time on the other side of the village and walking in the opposite direction. How should investigators interpret two separate sightings that occur so close in time, yet point in different directions? The Smiths also described the man differently, saying he was carrying the child against his chest, not stretched out in his arms. Still, based on the man's physical description, Gonzalo Amaral notes that they could have been speaking of the same person. The third contradiction, in Amaral's view, emerges with the window. If, at 9:20 p.m., Jane Tanner saw the abductor with the child, and Kate McCann later noticed that the children's bedroom window had been opened, why did Russell O'Brien and Matthew Oldfield, who checked the apartments after 9:20 p.m., not see the open window? Amaral states, "This is impossible. If the child had been abducted at the time Jane claimed, then the window should have been open from that very moment." Yet Matthew Oldfield, who entered the apartment, never mentioned seeing it. The conclusion drawn was that the window had only been opened after the supposed abduction took place. Following this, the investigation pursued over 350 leads, including reports claiming Madeleine had been seen in Morocco. Eventually, suspicion fell on Robert Murat, a local man who spoke both Portuguese and English and had volunteered to help with the search. He was made an arguido, a person of interest, though not yet a formal suspect. While no evidence justified his detention, his behavior seemed unusual to some observers. Amaral points out that journalists suspected Murat early on, but instead of following media speculation, investigators focused on testimony, particularly Jane Tanner's, because without her account, the abduction theory itself collapsed. Her testimony placed a man carrying a child walking in the direction of Murat's house. What happened next, according to Amaral, further exposed contradictions. Jane Tanner was placed in a surveillance vehicle and asked to observe people passing by. Among them was Murat, whom she identified based only on the way he walked, claiming he was the man she had seen. As time went on, her memory appeared to improve. First, she contributed to a vague EFIT sketch. Later, she identified Murat positively, and months after that, she helped create another EFIT, this time reportedly recalling every detail of a face that looked nothing like Murat's. Another piece of information used against Murat was a psychological profile produced by British experts, which suggested his voluntary, helpful attitude could in fact be the mask of a criminal. Amaral dismisses this, saying such theories were based on generalities and statistical guesses that could apply to anyone. While the investigation circled around contradictions and suspects, the media frenzy grew into a global phenomenon. Images of Madeleine filled the world's screens, and appeals for prayers, donations, and information spread everywhere. The case was no longer just a Portuguese investigation. It had become an international spectacle. The abduction theory, Amaral explains, eventually led into a blind alley. He claims that even the McCann family themselves began to consider the possibility that Madeleine was no longer alive, hiring a former South African military officer who claimed to use a special machine to locate remains. He pointed to a vast area where Madeleine's remains were supposedly buried, but after a thorough search, nothing was found. With the investigation at a stalemate, the turnaround came when Portuguese authorities brought in 2 highly trained specialist dogs from the UK, animals already credited with solving over 200 difficult cases. Eddie, a victim recovery dog, was trained to detect the odor of human remains. Keela, a blood detection dog, specialized in finding traces of human blood in amounts so tiny they often go unnoticed. The dogs first inspected the homes connected to the case, the apartments of the McCanns and their friends, and the house of Robert Murat. The results were striking. The dogs only reacted inside the apartment where the McCann family had stayed. Eddie, the victim recovery dog, alerted in 2 places. First, he marked the wardrobe in the McCann's bedroom, pressing his nose into the corner and signaling the unmistakable scent associated with human remains. Then, he alerted again behind the sofa in the apartment's living room. Keela was then brought in, and she confirmed the presence of human blood behind that same sofa. According to Amaral, the implication was clear. Either human remains had been kept in that spot for some time, or had at least passed through the apartment. The dogs' investigation continued with several vehicles, but once again, they only reacted to one, the Renault Scenic that the McCanns had rented 23 days after Madeleine's disappearance. Eddie alerted to both the car key and the boot, signaling they had been in contact with human remains. Keela confirmed by detecting organic traces for forensic analysis inside the boot. Even more telling were other alerts. The dogs signaled on Kate McCann's clothing and Madeleine's own soft toy. For Amaral, these findings raised disturbing questions. How was it possible that a toy carried constantly by the child could show the scent associated with human remains, while the bed, where she supposedly slept, showed no signs at all? The dogs had reportedly never failed in more than 200 previous cases. Their alerts marked 2 areas inside the apartment: the McCann's rental car, Kate's clothing, and Madeleine's toy. According to Amaral, their work could hardly have been more revealing. According to Gonzalo Amaral, this was the true turning point in the investigation. The abduction theory began to lose its strength, while the hypothesis of Madeleine McCann's passing gained consistency. From this point, the parents, their friends, and even their relatives were no longer just witnesses. They became suspects. The forensic samples collected in Portugal were sent to the Forensic Science Service in Birmingham, one of the most respected laboratories in the UK. Almost immediately, speculation began. The Times newspaper published that some preliminary results did not match Madeleine's DNA, a claim the lab denied. Other journalists, however, insisted they had seen early reports suggesting otherwise. One of those journalists explained that preliminary findings had pointed to blood traces inside the apartment, and that later documentation signed by more than 10 FSS scientists showed a striking result: a correspondence of 17 out of 19 markers with Madeleine McCann's DNA. In their eyes, there was more than enough data to conclude it was hers. To understand the process, Amaral points to the forensic method used: low copy number analysis. Because the samples collected from the apartment and the McCann's rental car were so small, scientists had to artificially amplify the DNA. The method can be useful, but it also risks amplifying background noise, making results more difficult to interpret. This places us at the heart of a modern forensic dilemma. How much weight can be placed on a scientific technique powerful enough to find a trace, but not always precise enough to provide an irrefutable identity? The FSS's final report was cautious. It concluded the samples could belong to Madeleine, but certainty was impossible. The most significant sample came from the boot of the Renault Scenic, rented by the McCanns 23 days after their daughter disappeared. Preliminary reports showed a match of 15 out of 16 markers, yet analysis also revealed that the material was not from a single source, but from at least 3 different people. An expert who examined the British scientist's notes explained that when multiple DNA contributors are mixed, especially if they are from the same family, profiles can appear to match more closely than they really do. This made the findings scientifically inconclusive. Still, Amaral stresses that the investigation was never based solely on science. Criminal investigations also weigh behavior, inconsistencies, and context. During questioning at the Policia Judiciaria in Portimao, both Kate and Gerry McCann were formally declared arguidos, persons of interest. Kate McCann refused to answer every question. Gerry McCann denied all accusations, insisting his daughter was alive. When investigators showed him the video of the specialist dogs marking locations in their apartment and car, Amaral recalls that he refused to even watch it, claiming it had no value. But how should one interpret such a reaction? Is it the dismissal of a grieving parent who believes the evidence is misleading, or an unwillingness to confront something more troubling? For many in Portugal, this reaction raised suspicion, and public opinion began to turn sharply against the couple. By September 2007, both Portuguese and British investigators had reportedly reached the same working conclusion: that Madeleine had passed away in the apartment and someone had moved the remains. It was at this time that Irishman Martin Smith, watching images of the McCann's departure from Portugal, had a sudden realization. Seeing Gerry McCann carry one of his twins, Smith said he instantly recognized the stance and the manner in which he held the child. Kate McCann's diary, later accessed by investigators, reveals just how crucial political support was. Prime Minister Gordon Brown phoned the couple several times and, during the Lisbon summit, even raised the matter with his Portuguese counterpart. Meanwhile, the Portuguese investigation faced mounting attacks from the British press. Following a pointed reply from Gonçalo Amaral to a former British detective in a news interview, the national director of the Portuguese Judiciary Police, backed by the Justice Minister, removed Amaral from the case. Officially, no explanation was offered. Amaral was reassigned, forced to abandon the investigation. He recalls someone approaching him with a thinly veiled message. Some investigations are not meant to succeed. Paulo Rebelo was appointed as his replacement, and while a reenactment of events was proposed, key testimonies were left unpursued. The Smith family, who reported seeing a man resembling Gerry McCann carrying a child toward the sea around 10 o'clock p.m. on May the 3rd, were never requested in Portugal. Furthermore, a neighbor near the McCann's second home in Aldeia da Luz, who testified that the boot of the rented car remained open day and night, was never called to testify in court despite signing a statement. This introduces a perplexing question. How did the family's relatives later know of this neighbor's testimony in order to offer an explanation for it, that they had transported leaking meat when it had never been formally heard in Portugal? Soon after the investigation was closed, Gonçalo Amaral resigned from the police and published his book. The McCann's spokesman, Clarence Mitchell, dismissed Amaral as an opportunist, accusing him of profiting from Madeleine's disappearance, and stating that if he truly had clues, he should have acted on them while leading the case. To prove his point, Gonçalo Amaral began by demonstrating why an abduction was, in his view, impossible. Together with a senior scientific police expert, Amaral showed that there was no evidence of forced entry into apartment 5A. The door showed no signs of tampering. The only ways to open such a lock without a key would have left traces, and none were found. The same applied to the windows, which would have shown clear marks had any tool been used to force them open. No such marks were present. The only fingerprints found on the bedroom window belonged to Kate McCann herself, and they reportedly showed not that she had closed the window, but that she had opened it. For Amaral, the conclusion was undeniable. There had been no abduction. Furthermore, he argued that it was impossible for anyone to leave through the window carrying a child without leaving evidence behind. To do so would have required stepping on the bed and dragging the child across the sill, yet no footprints or marks were ever found. When the physical evidence of a crime scene directly contradicts the narrative of a break-in, how should investigators proceed? Does the absence of evidence for one theory become evidence for another? Adding this to the alerts from the specialist dogs and the statement from the Smith family, Amaral concluded that the most probable scenario was that Madeleine McCann passed away in apartment 5A, and that her remains were later concealed. The scent associated with human remains was detected behind the sofa, and human blood was also found there containing a DNA profile that was a partial match to Madeleine. It was the only spot inside the apartment where both findings overlapped. Within police logic, this was the place where the tragic event most likely occurred. According to Amaral's hypothesis, the child may have woken in the night, climbed onto the sofa, and fallen, fatally striking her head. He also raised the possibility that a sedative, such as Calpol, sometimes given to the children to help them sleep, might have played a role, a practice he noted was later confirmed by Kate McCann's father. Later that night, the man seen by the Smith family, whom they identified as resembling Gerry McCann, was carrying a child toward the beach. Amaral stated firmly, "Madeleine McCann died in apartment 5A on the 3rd of May 2007. I am certain that this truth will be established someday." He argued that the investigation was brutally interrupted and derailed by political influence. Some theories suggest the children may have been medicated to ensure they slept soundly. If so, and if an accident then occurred, an autopsy could have revealed this, potentially leading to serious repercussions. This presents a profound ethical dilemma. In a moment of panic, is it plausible that the instinct for self-preservation could override the instinct to call for help? On the morning of September 7, 2007, Kate McCann was summoned to the Portimao police station and declared an arguida, a formal suspect. Police files released later suggested they were investigating a scenario in which she could have been implicated in Madeleine's accidental passing. Some context is important here. Kate McCann was a trained anesthetist. During her police interview, detectives asked her 48 questions. She refused to answer all of them. Several questions appeared to focus on the idea that she may have sedated Madeleine and the twins, including, why did the twins not wake up during the search? Following her lawyer's advice, she exercised her right to silence. It is possible that Kate McCann felt the police were no longer searching for Madeleine, but instead were building a case against her and Gerry. Still, some ask why a mother wouldn't answer any question that might help find her missing child. At the end of the interview, detectives put one final question to her. Are you aware that in not answering the questions, you are jeopardizing the investigation, which seeks to discover what happened to your daughter? Kate McCann replied, yes, if that's what the investigation thinks. On Portuguese television, Gerry McCann vigorously denied any suggestion that Madeleine or the twins were ever sedated. The Portuguese police's suspicion about sedation appeared to stem from a statement given by a GNR officer, José Roque, one of the first law enforcement officials to arrive at apartment 5A. The GNR, it is worth remembering, are Portugal's National Guard, not the official criminal police. In his statement, Officer Roque recalled that the twins, Sean and Amaral, never woke up despite the chaos unfolding around them. With people moving in and out of the apartment, the twins remained motionless, sleeping throughout the entire ordeal. In his testimony, Roque also described Kate and Gerry McCann as nervous and anxious, claiming he did not see either of them shed actual tears, instead stating that they produced noises identical to crying. But how reliable is an external observation of grief? Reactions to trauma differ immensely from person to person. Some may fall into hysteria, while others freeze in what can look like shock. In a 2007 BBC Panorama investigation, Gerry McCann was filmed reflecting on the night of May 3rd. He discussed the twins being sound asleep and alluded to the possibility of sedation, not by the parents, but by a potential abductor. 5 months later, in October, strands of hair were taken from Sean and Amaral and tested for traces of sedatives. The results came back clear. Former lead detective Gonçalo Amaral later argued that these toxicology tests had been carried out far too late. If sedatives had been administered, he claimed, the traces would have long since disappeared from the children's systems. Inside apartment 5A, there was a blue two-seat sofa in the living room, pushed up against the wall beneath a sliding window. One of the most persistent theories is that the sofa itself may have played a role in what happened. The idea is that Madeleine, perhaps unsteady, might have climbed onto the couch near the window, from where she could have fallen, or ended up in a position that tragically led to her passing. What makes this theory harder to dismiss is that both the victim recovery and blood detection dogs alerted behind that very sofa. This presents a stark choice between two possibilities. a catastrophic failure of highly trained specialist dogs, or the unthinkable presence of human remains in that spot. While some argue a kidnapper could have panicked and hidden her there, the more logical explanation, from an investigative standpoint, is that an accident happened, and Madeleine's remains ended up behind the couch. Still, when people find themselves in a sudden crisis, they do not always react rationally. Panic can drive desperate decisions, such as quickly moving remains to avoid being blamed, not because it was thought through, but because fear takes over. This line of reasoning helps to explain why the Portuguese police did not immediately rule out the McCanns as suspects. After examining all the evidence and the ground covered in Madeleine's story, we arrive at the central alternative hypothesis that has persisted throughout this investigation, that Madeleine McCann passed away in apartment 5A, and that her remains were later moved. But by whom? There is evidence that points toward possible answers, and that is precisely why many believe Operation Grange must return to the very beginning and re-examine every possibility. Anything less, they argue, would be a travesty for an innocent child who is still missing. As this exploration draws to a close, we are left not with certainty, but with the profound weight of an unresolved tragedy. For nearly 2 decades, a little girl's face has haunted the global conscience. Her story, a labyrinth of conflicting theories, forensic dead ends, and human anguish. After journeying through the shadows of this case, how has it settled within you? Do you feel a sense of frustration, of deep sadness, or perhaps a renewed demand for a truth that feels just beyond our grasp? What does justice for Madeleine McCann look like now? And what is our collective responsibility in ensuring her story is never forgotten? Not as a spectacle, but as a solemn reminder of a life that was lost.